that I have that in the past in terms of presenting you the update. Obviously, in respect to Leanne, that this information and a lot of stuff you may have not heard, or I apologize if I use acronyms. I will make every effort to describe what I'm saying. But just before I forget off the topic, the gentleman was mentioning something about could this board decide to delay and not take action on this item tonight. So this item tonight basically is a snapshot. Well, it's the financial solvency. It'll go off. It'll stop. But tonight the document that you're reviewing and I'm presenting on and you will ultimately approve is a snapshot. It's a snapshot of our current fiscal solvency for the year. It's really out to all the action item is tonight. But the process for getting this approved, we actually do have to submit to the county, and we have a deadline by the 13th of December, and that's for the first interim, and then for second interim, we have I think a March 15th or March 13th deadline. So the timing of this, unfortunately, we don't have the ability to postpone taking any action on the interim report. So I just wanted to state that. Anyway, I'll get into the presentation, and I see that many of you have our documents. I'm going to walk through this document. I've not done this with you since I've been here, so just to kind of familiarize yourself with these documents. One of these documents is labeled SACS report, and one of these documents is titled Fiscal Financial Report. Essentially, they are both the same thing. The one document that refers to as a SACS document is really that state form where we document all of the information by fund. The other gentleman was talking about the summary checklist. What he was referring to was the criteria and standards. So when we adopt a budget, we have to go through and certify through the criteria and standards whether we meet certain criteria, and it's an indication. It's really put in place for the county as well as the state to monitor a school district to determine whether or not they are either on a path of maintaining their fiscal solvency, or perhaps they're on the path of perhaps not being in a good financial situation where they're having to file what I will share with you in a few minutes, something other than a positive certification. So I'll go through some of those details, but the difference between these reports, one is more or less the state form, and then the other document, Julia Hughes, who does such a great job in preparing this document, kind of gives you some more details, some pie charts, and what I've done is my presentation that I'm going to show you up here kind of summarizes all of that information. So I'm going to refer to each one of these as we go through it. I apologize, but the presentation is really, again, to the point. I want to identify all the things I believe you need to understand from your perspective. And again, basically, this budget update is, again, a budget update, because when I presented to you in June of last year the adopted budget, I've shared with you at that time, and I'll continue to share with you. And the budget is only as good as assumptions at the point in time. As we go through this entire process, those assumptions are going to change. So I will never tell you what I'm giving you is going to be set in stone, because things are going to change. And so let me dive into the presentation. I know we've been here for quite a while, so I want to make sure I have time for questions. But what's up here basically is that calendar. Tonight we're going to take a look at what the differences are between what was adopted in June and what the current working budget is as of October 31st. And again, staff will be going through this exercise between now and March, updating the budget to account for any changes since now. And then as we're obviously going through this fiscal year, we're going to start having the conversations around next year's budget for 2017-18. So, and I appreciate Wendy talking about it, is that I will take as many opportunities, if the board will allow me, to come and give you an update on the budget. Obviously, when you look at the budget cycle of the budget season, come January, we start hearing what the governor has in mind. So many of us attend the workshop in school services, and I bring back that information to share with us, because that's really our launch point. That's where we start our conversations, and we know what the governor is thinking about in terms of what he's projecting. At that same time, too, the Legislative Analyst's Office, the Department of Finance, as well as school services, they're starting to look at what those outer year assumptions look like, because when I bring to you this budget, we're not only looking at it from a one-year perspective. We have to look at our entire budget over a 3-year span of time. But actually, let me take one step back. I appreciate the board for the wherewithal to think about, we need to look at this budget not 1 year or not only 3 years, but look at the 5-year picture. Because most importantly, that 5-year picture later on when I talk about the STRs and PERS has a huge impact, because if districts are only looking at it from a 3-year period of time, there are still 2 more years further out that tie back to that impact around the STRs and PERS cost increase. So being mindful of the budget, and as a CBO, those are things I need to bring to your attention as a board member. I fully expect you to ask questions about that. And that's the reason why I point these things out, is that something that you do need to know. So what you see here is the budget calendar. Again, we'll update this when actually after we approve the budget calendar for 2017-18. I'll update this for the next time. So this document here, the SACS report. So the first page, this is the first page. So this is that certification. This is where myself, actually the board doesn't sign this. Wendy signs it and I sign it. Our names are on this, stating, this is a statement that based on the district's finances, based on the set assumptions we're using, the district will be able to meet its financial obligations. When we file a positive certification, we're meeting our financial obligations, not only just in the current year, but actually out 2 years. And so that's the outcome we're trying to achieve here. But if for some reason the school district is in that situation where they are going several years now with the possibilities of deficit spending, the first indication is that they will be filing a qualified certification. And usually when the district files a qualified certification, it's not that tomorrow they're on the verge of bankruptcy. What it means is they don't have yet a plan that they could identify in terms of how to deal with those structural deficits. So that's usually the progression. District gets into budget situations when the fiscal assumptions change on them, and then what they will typically do is they will forecast out and say that, well, there's that possibility the district may not be able to meet its obligations out in those further year. And then by the time you reach this negative status, the County Office of Education, the state is already aware that you're in a district that's dealing with some major financial problems. And so, you know, it takes a little while before you get to that stage, but it's important that people understand why this tiered system is set up, so that it's an indication for people, not just for staff, but for the county as far as oversight and the state, to see if we are on a path of, again, bad times or not. I pulled out some slides from the presentation. Really, as I said, this budget is based on a lot of assumptions, and then to kind of reiterate, we're going to be spending even more opportunities about talking about other things related to the budget. In January, just as a heads up, we'll be bringing our demographer, Tom Williams, and we're going to give the board an update on the enrollment. As you all understand, that enrollment projection is a major component of how this budget is built, because staffing is tied to enrollment, facilities, all staffing is tied to the enrollment piece. So we need to see whether or not our enrollment is continuing to show either, you know, a decline, or if we're at a point right now where the enrollment is starting to stabilize. But I believe, you know, as Tom's projection, we are projected to go through a span of decline for the next like 3 to 5 years. So that's why I wanted to point this out. And again, I know, having been here the last 2 years, I've been hearing across the district that there are people in the community that didn't believe. They didn't believe that the district was declining enrollment. But when you look at this, we're in our 3rd year of decline. So it's very clear to me that we are in a mode of decline. And Tom's projections going forward, a lot of it's based on birth rate information. He had shared with me that this last year, what he was anticipating as far as the birth rate for 2016 was a little less than what he was anticipating. So I won't take this thunder away, but he's going to talk about things like that. But again, this is just for information. This is where we are in enrollment. Basically, as of this year, CBEDS, we are at about 18,605. we were down about 300 kids from last year. And again, that's a trend that's projected to continue. ADA is a component of the funding. Everyone understand the differences between enrollment and ADA? I think enrollment is actual enrollment, kids enrolled. ADA is the funding mechanism. So basically, if we had 100% attendance, our enrollment and ADA would be equal. But we don't have 100% attendance. So the ADA is reflective of average daily attendance, or basically seat time in the classroom. So when you look at our ADA, so our funded ADA is about 18,220. Actually, I think this next slide shows the comparison. So when you look at enrollment compared to ADA, and you look at overtime, that difference between ADA and enrollment, I would probably closely relate that to our attendance rate. So we've been very good. We're in the 98% range as far as the difference between funded ADA and enrollment. We did drop a little bit. Last year it was 98.13. Estimates right now is 97.9. I mean, a difference of 1% could be $1 million for a district our size. So it's important, and that'd be one of my messages at the end of the day. What can we do as far as dealing with the enrollment? Just need to probably maximize our attendance as much as possible. Anyway, I just put this up here just for information. Getting into some of the nuts and bolts with our budget, LCFF, local control funding formula, is our funding model. And what I'm showing basically up here is how the per funding is broken down by grade span. And please keep in mind too, what I'm showing you here basically is that target. I didn't bring back that kind of funky graph I was showing you before, where I'm showing, you know, the gap. There's that gap between where we are currently funded and what that target is. We're actually getting closer to closing that gap. I think I shared with you, we're about 3.5% difference between closing that gap. I think the Legislative Analyst's Office was saying that based on their projections for next year, they believe that the remaining gap may be closed this coming year. But anyway, what I'm showing everyone up here is really that target. And when I say target, back to our pre-recession levels, back to 07, 08. So we're getting back to our funding level where we were at that point in time. The only difference between what we were receiving in 2007-08 was COLA. So whatever COLA we've received since that point in time, that target amount has moved up a little bit. But if we were at full funding back to our pre-recession levels of 07, 08, and if you take into account the COLAs that we've gotten since 2007-08, this is about how much we would be receiving on a per student basis. So for K3, which is including the class size reduction funding that we get, we would be getting a little bit more than $8,000 for those kids between TK and 3. This actually should be TK. Middle school, actually, I'm sorry, intermediate school, 7,400 and about 7,600 for middle school. One of the other things I want to point out, I remember Wendy mentioning something about as a school district. We're one of those unique school districts where we're considered a low wealth district when you look at it, comparing ourselves to other districts, especially here in the county. And it's because of our demographics. We do not take advantage of some of these additional funding components here. So let me take one step back. So Wendy referenced the base funding. Every school district receives base funding. If you're an elementary school district, you get class size reduction money. But then the next two strands of money here dependent upon your demographics. If we're a school district that has a high number of English language learners or a high percentage of students that qualify for free and reduced, then if that was our school district, we would be receiving a sizable amount of money under the supplemental as well as the concentration. But because of our demographics, we only have about barely 16% of our population fit into that category. So really what it means is we only receive just a little bit of supplemental funding, which is 20% of the base, and we don't receive any of the concentration funding. If we had gotten it, it would be in 50% of that basic grant. But there's a minimum qualification. We have to have a minimum of 55% of our population. Actually, you don't get any funding on the first 55% of the population. It's actually anything over 55% that you would receive the extra funding for that. So if I was going to compare ourselves to Allen Rock, who has probably an 80 to probably low 90% free and reduced and ELL population, they're making out quite a bit. And obviously, we can't compare. I'll get off my soapbox on that one. So I'm going to kind of go right into what are some of the changes. And again, tonight, this item is an update in terms of what was presented to you in June, and obviously what's been changed or addressed in the budget. Actually, I shared this with you. I shared this with you at the last meeting because Julia was out, and we had her start working on First Interim. So some of this information changed just a little bit, but really it's essentially almost what I shared with you. But what I'm sharing with the board here are the changes with the revenue side of the budget. So roughly, when you look at all these categories, there were some slight increases and decreases, but a net change on the revenue side of the budget to the tune of about $107,000. And that was, again, since we adopted in June. And keep in mind, when I present to you in March, I'm going to do the same thing. There will be changes with some of those revenue assumptions. Now, on the other side of the budget is the expenditure side. So here are some of the changes with the budget on the expenditure side. These items here that I've put.
I'm just going to stop you for a second, just because it's come a number of times that it changes every single time. I just want you to one more time, just for everybody's sake, say why it changes. And as you had reviewed earlier, it is it's not written in stone. So if you could just one more time state those facts.
Sure. Okay. So again, the budget's going to change throughout the year for various reasons. There are things that are either known at the time or things that are not known at the time. There's a lot of exterior influences on what's going on. Obviously, like with the expenditure side, what I'm showing you right now takes into no effect right now anything that may be negotiated at the table. I have to presume at this point in time that, I can't make an assumption yet that there's going to be any kind of settlement, so I can't put that into the budget as yet. But should we negotiate, should we settle on something, that would be a change in the budget. Other things that would change, obviously, well actually, the reason one of the big changes of the budget here too is, I shared with you last time, when we adopt our budget, at that point in time, we assume no carryover, because we have not closed the books for last year. So when we actually close the books, that's when staff posts the carryover. So these items here in this, teal color here, these were additional changes to the budget to account for carryover. But these other items here are changes to the budget that were ongoing, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But some of these things were due to revisions in the budget. Like the first one's a good example. When we adopted the budget, we had estimated I don't know what the total amount is, but we estimated a certain dollar amount for substitute teacher costs. I'm not talking about anything for professional development, but basically for staff that's out on sick or maternity leave or personal necessity. So when we closed the books, we had to revise what was in the budget and increase that budget by almost $340,000 because at the time we under budgeted that amount because that had not been the trend. But when we actually closed the books, we looked at it and said, okay, well, we need to possibly budget as much as we spent last year to take into account the possibility of, again, going through a second year without additional cost. So we've accounted for that. But again, those assumptions are going to change. We're going to always share. You're going to think I'm a broken record about the budget. I'm going to keep saying is that these assumptions are going to change, and they will. And they will. And then also, too, I'll say this later, we don't spend every dollar, but from a budgetary standpoint, I can't assume that we don't spend anything right now in the middle of the year. So what I'm showing you, all of these budget amounts, we're presuming that we're going to spend everything until we actually get closer to the year and then we actually build next year's budget.
Chris, when we were at CSBA, again in the new board member session, so Ron Bennett, who is from School Services and is the guru of budgets in California and works with school districts on their budgets. One of the things he was sharing with board members is that it's the exact opposite of what you think. If your CBO brings you the same budget, so in other words, that budget doesn't change, and Chris comes in here first interim, second interim, an audit, everything he brings, it starts to align and everything's exactly the same, he says that's when your school district's in trouble and you better basically find another CBO. Because nothing in school finance works that way, because everything is in flux, and it's based on those assumptions, and even on the revenue side is similar.
Okay. Oh, I apologize, I'll keep moving here. So those are some of the changes on the budget, but these were some of the bigger changes on the budget. So special education, routine repair, these two programs here, we don't obviously get sufficient amount of funding either from the state or from the federal government. So when there are increases in those programs or those additional services being provided, we have to increase those budgets, and it creates an encroachment on the budget. The largest one here in the world of special education was an additional $809,000 of additional salary costs related to the salary adjustments for our behavioral therapists or behavioral therapist tutors, I believe that's their title. And so that was not in the budget when we adopted it, so we revised the budget to account for that. So that's added about $1.1 million. Well, actually, that portion is about $809,000. There were some reductions in revenue, and then we had to increase the budget about $91,000 for current known special ed settlements. So that increased the budget by about $1.1 million. And then routine repair, I shared with the board when we brought to you the open space agreement with the city of Cupertino. That was about $135,000 of additional costs to account for the watering. So that's why I'm showing you here. And again, as of right now, I'm showing to you that these are increased or ongoing costs to the budgets, because this is what is contributing to what I will share with you, that structural deficit, and where we're going to how we're going to come up with the amount of funding that we'll need to reduce to balance that budget. So total about $1.3 million. The next few slides, again, it's a summary of what's in your book. I just provided you some nice little pie charts to give you some perspective. So this first slide here is this is everything. This is the entire district budget. It's not just the general fund. It's everything. It's including our Measure H program, our child nutrition services, that's our food service program. This is everything in terms of, this is the total amount of budget we manage. So about $275 million is everything that we manage. But today's presentation is going to be just on the general fund, the $195 million. So getting into the general fund, this is just the revenue. As you probably would understand, that most of our revenue is driven again by student attendance. Most of our revenue is driven by state funding. It's all in the area of LCFF revenue. We still continue to receive federal funding. Those types of federal programs we're kind of familiar with: Title I, Title II, special education. So we receive, about $4 million in federal revenue. We do still get some state revenue. There's still some old categorical money. Categorical money are those restricted programs. Those were specific programs with specific mandates, and that from a budgetary standpoint, those dollars need to be tracked separately and accounted for. So we still have state revenue that we have to keep track of. Other local revenue, let me point that out. Out of that $21 million, $6 million of that is our parcel tax. So thank you, community, for supporting the parcel tax. That represents a large part of our budget. So actually, yeah, out of the 11% of the budget, most of it is parcel tax. But then when you look at the rest of it, 85%, a little bit more than 85% of the budget comes from the state. So as you would imagine, as the state economy goes up, so does school district finance, budgeting. But as the state economy tanks, well, our funding starts to dry up. So this is really the indication of whether or not, from an economic standpoint, the state is performing well or they're not. But this is about average. I mean, most districts are receiving around 85% or more. If your basic aid district, we'll talk a little bit about that later, you receive a lot more than this. So I'm breaking out here in the slide. There's still unrestricted dollars and restricted dollars. $23 million. Just tuck that in the back of your mind. That's that total amount of contribution. I mentioned a little bit about it in the crossing guard conversation. Transportation, $23 million of transportation, special ed, routine repair maintenance. It's about $23 million that requires a contribution or infusion from the general fund to maintain those programs. Now we're going to get into the expenditure side. That's the other half of the budget. So what I'm showing you basically here is how the budget's broken down into the major categories. And that's what your document shows. When you actually get into the document, it starts showing you based on, you'll see a reference as object code. Object code basically describes the categories. So object code 1000 is going to depict all of the certificated salaries. And object code 2000 is going to depict all the classified salaries. Object code 3000 is going to depict all the related benefits. You'll hear us sometimes refer to the 4,000 accounts. Those 4,000 accounts are supplies and materials. 5,000 accounts are consultants, contractors, utilities, and that represents a large portion of our budget as well. We won't have a lot of money spent out of the general fund for capital outlay, and that's a good thing. We want to make sure it's spent on other things that aren't, like facilities and everything. But when you look at the total pie, 85% of our budget is spent on personnel costs, and that's a good indication. Most districts are spending close to 85% of their budget. You should be questioning ourselves if we were spending a lot less than 85% of our budget on personnel, because, right, we're in the business of educating kids. We have teachers who educate kids. That's where the majority of our costs go. But you'll see this number kind of fluctuating by 0.5%, but no more than 1% when you look at the total budget. Here's a split between restricted and unrestricted of the expenditures. One of the things that, if you go back in time before LCFF, most of that funding we were getting from the state was all restricted, all kind of strings attached. A lot of that revenue a lot of those expenditures would have shown up on this pie chart. Because of LCFF, those monies have moved to this side here, giving school districts that autonomy, the ability to make those decisions at a local level as far as how they spend those dollars, and it's tied back to our LCAP plan. Here's a graph. This kind of shows you the budget in a different perspective. I showed you a little bit about how we spend money in object codes, types of expenditures. This kind of gives you a better perspective in terms of the areas, the function. These are where we're spending our dollars in terms of instruction, instruction-related services, pupil services, special education, general administration. So when you look at this is how it's broken out, but maybe this gives you a better perspective in terms of percentages. When you add up all the most relevant pieces of the pie, 84.5% of our budget is spent on kids. It's either instructional or instructional-related services. This is again one of those things you want to take a look at. Make sure that we're not spending money in the key areas. Because if we were spending a lot less than 80% of our budget on non-instructional things, you'd be looking at me and say, why are we doing that? So this is a good indication when I present to you, this is where we are in terms of our spending. So here's the meat of the presentation tonight and why you're having to certify our current fiscal our current fiscal situation. So I said a little earlier, when you look at the budget, you can't look at it in 1 year. You can't look at it 1 year at a time. Actually, you have to look at it over a span of time. As far as the state goes, all they are concerned about is 3 years, 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19. So that's all they care about. But again, appreciate the board with knowing with the wherewithal to say, staff, bring it out 2 more years to see what that impact looks like. So what I'm showing you here on this graph, I'll kind of walk us through this. Basically, it's like it starts at the top. The top is our beginning balance. This is what we ended last year with. So this is obviously what we start with. I'm showing how much we're receiving in revenue, and all this matches those pie charts. So if you want to check, but all of the revenue I'm projecting here, the expenditures that we're projecting here, and again, remember I had said that I'm assuming right now we're spending every dollar because I don't know how we're going to end up closing the books yet. But so under this scenario, should we spend all of the dollars actually receive all the revenue, spend all the dollars this year. The projected ending fund balance goes from $28.5 million, drops down to $4.3 million. So you may be asking, Chris, why does it drop? Why are you projecting a decline? Because I'm showing here that we're deficit spending. Deficit spending means we're spending more in any one year compared to what we're receiving that year. So under this scenario, if we spend everything, we're projected to be deficit spending by about $4.1 million. Some of this is the spend down of one-time dollars. We've been receiving the last 4 years an infusion of one-time dollars. It all started with the Common Core implementation funds. The following year was some of the mandated cost revenue, and this last year it was educators' effectiveness money. So those were all infusions of one-time dollars that the state gave us like 2 years or 3 years to spend them all down. So that's why also we're showing that we're spending more in that year than what we received, because we actually received a lot of that money the year before. So like with educator effectiveness, it was a 2-year spend down plan, but we received all the money the year before. So that's why I'm showing the deficit spending here. But really the point I want to make here is I'm showing you in red here that there's a possibility, if we don't do anything, that we're going to continue to project deficit spending based on the current assumptions. Again, those assumptions are going to change, but based on the assumptions that we have right now, unless we do something, if we continue to deficit spend, we're going to get into some dangerous areas. One of the requirements that we have to meet as a school district based on the size of our enrollment, at the end of the day, we need to show a 3% reserve requirement. But our board has elected by board policy to set aside additional funds above that 3% level. So for fiscal solvency purposes, I have to show that we meet our 3% reserve over 3 years. But when you look at this scenario here, the third year becomes a problem because of this deficit spending. If we don't do anything, and again, everything's still based on status quo, we would be having to reduce our reserve level. Again, that reserve level is 3% plus the additional board reserve, down from where it is currently, about $11.8 million down to $5.9 million. I see a question.
So Chris, on that, is sorry Penny. For the 3% board reserve, the 11 million, are you taking it out at 3% of the 195 million? Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, so the minimum 3% reserve is based on what you
so it looks
projected.
like about 6 million is enough for
Yeah,
3%.
it's about 6 million.
Okay.
Well, the additional board reserve is almost the equivalent of $6 million, yes.
Right, so when we're at 11, we're higher than what we need.
Correct. So if nothing else happens and nothing else changes and we don't do a single thing, 18, 19, the conversation we'll have here is we won't be able to maintain that additional board reserve. But it's even more of an issue because the following year, still, if you don't do anything, we won't have enough money to cover the 3% reserve. And so again, it's just for our, right now, it's for our awareness right now because we have time to plan this out. We have to plan this out, but without some efforts on all of our parts here, we do need to start identifying some amount of cuts to get us or to stay ahead of this. Because in a few minutes, I'll show you some information on the PERS and STIRS impact. The PERS and STIRS impact actually takes us to 2021. Based on that, the yearly increases for STIRS and PERS takes us out to the year 2021. Beyond 2021 right now, it's anyone's guess. The belief is that they will no longer continue to increase the employer contribution, but we don't know yet whether or not there's even a belief that they'll lower the rate, because this whole increase with the STIRS and PERS costs were to account for that unfunded liability. So if the state says, well, we've made that pension system whole, maybe they will adjust those rates back down to where they were, but it's too far out and I can't make that assumption. So the assumption right now is that those rates will continue, but we need to do something between now and then to stay ahead of this. So at a minimum, we need to cut, well again, one caveat. Assuming we don't spend everything, obviously we're gonna have some carryover from 16-17 that goes into 17-18. But right now, based on this, what I'm sharing with you, we need to cut about a minimum of $3 million just to stay ahead of the concern that the board may have around maintaining that board reserve. But that only gets us basically out to 19-20. We may have to cut more than $3 million. I'm going to say anywhere from $3 million to $4 million right now to stay ahead of this situation here. And that, again, that's just to maintain the status quo. Because right now, we haven't done anything. We're sitting down at the table for the first time, and so this doesn't account anything from a salary adjustment or anything like that. This is just right now accounting for what we do know. We have the salary schedules that we have everyone placed on the salary schedules. We can forecast what those costs are. Obviously, the only thing that can change are some of those statutory benefit changes. But this is as good information that we have at this point in time. And so really, this is really what I want to show you is that, this is that 5-year look. And most of this impact and the cuts is the STRS and PERS costs. Because if you don't mind, I'm going to jump into, well, actually before that, here are those contributions. So $27 million is the current budget right now for the contribution for both transportation, special ed, and routine repair. So transportation, I mentioned, is about $2.1 million encroachment on the general fund. And keep in mind, that's both regular ed and special ed. So I know that the board was asking if we could break out that cost. So we'd have to break out the regular ed from the special ed. Our special ed program encroaches almost $19.8 million, and then routine repair is about $5.7 million. PERS and STRS. So, as we mentioned, this is right now the structure that's set up that's accounting for the incremental increases. So, Wendy mentioned back when we first started this, the employer contribution was 8.25%. It's projected to go up to exactly 19.2% by the year 2021. And it's, other than the first year increase, it's been about almost a 2% increase each year. So 2%, and then next year an additional 2%, next year an additional 2%. So those are increased ongoing costs. And so the challenge we've had is that those annual increased costs are happening, but then when you mentioned about the COLA, you've heard me talk about this year we got a zero COLA. We got the same amount of money that literally we got last year. The only difference is we got a little bit less money because we had fewer students. But we essentially got a zero COLA. So when the STRS and PERS thing is hitting us, to the tune of, almost 2%, it's starting to add up. So I'm showing, I apologize, it's really small here. Let me see if I can blow some of it up. So what I'm showing you here basically is a cumulative effect of the STRS and PERS increase on a payroll, roughly about, $108 million in payroll. But when you look at 16-17 STRS, the increased cost is about $2.6 million. For PERS, it's about $680,000. So it's a little bit more than $2 million in terms of an additional cost to the budget. So as I said, last year it increased by 2%. It was like an additional $2 million of ongoing costs to the budget. Next year again, another almost 2% increase. And if we keep the salaries at the same thing, it's an additional 1.92% increase to the budget. So when you look at it, I just wrote on my notes here. When you calculate based on the amount of salary payroll we have, right? The amount of employees we have, and this is all groups, a 1% increase onto salary represents about a $1.4 million cost to the budget. So when it's $2 million of additional cost, that's the equivalent of about a 1.4% pay raise. when you look at it in terms of cost comparison. So that's something that I think people need to hear and understand, is that that's something that right now is out of our ability to control. Those are added costs, no additional funding from the state, and that money is taken right off the top. And again, add insult to injury, this last year we got a 0 COLA.
So just to add on to that is that we have an increase of COLA, we have an increase for stir and purse by 2% and a 0 COLA, so overall our expenses have gone up, and we are basically deficit spending right there.
It continues to erode the fund balance, yes. And then for those of us who don't understand what really when you start hearing about our neighbors being a basic aid district, I put this little graphic together just to kind of give some people a visual in terms of what is the difference between us, our district, which is an LCFF funded district, or an enrollment-based district, compared to a basic aid district. So under the basic aid scenario, basically all districts receive an amount of property tax, right? Whatever amount of property tax that they get basically goes in and fills in what you are entitled to receive when you look at it on a per student and a per dollar amount per student. Determine how much funding you receive. So what I'm showing you here basically is under scenario, when you calculate the number of students that receive, multiply that by the amount of money we receive per student, that gives us the volume of this bucket in terms of how much we're supposed to receive as far as student funding. But then when you start filling in that bucket, and if your property tax base far exceeds what you receive, or what you're eligible to receive under the LCFF model, all that extra revenue you get to keep. So if I'm a basic aid district, I'm a Palo Alto Unified, I'm a Los Altos, I'm a Los Gatos, Sunnyvale, our Fremont High School district, all of the districts around us are technically a basic aid district because of their property tax. So under that scenario, they get to keep the extra. So in our case, our parcel tax only fills the bucket up only so far. And so basically the additional funding that make us whole comes from the state, and that's represented with that state aid portion. Actually, I thought this was kind of interesting because, maybe a lot of people don't understand, is it really easy for someone to become a basic aid district? But when you look at our numbers, right? So based on the property tax that we get between the 6 city jurisdictions that we reside in, we receive about $107 million in terms of total property tax. Based on the number of kids that we have, based on that dollar amount per child, we receive about $146 million of LCF funding. The delta, the difference between, is what we get from the state. So if you look at it in terms of, on a per student basis, we get $7,527 per child right now. Our enrollment currently is based on 18,585, actually our ADA is based on 18,585. So when you kind of do the math, for us to be a basic aid district, because the property tax represents a little bit more than 73% of our total budget, for us to become basic aid, our property taxes would have to increase in excess of the $146 million. So I calculate that to be our property tax base would have to increase by 36% or more. Or based on having 18,585 students, our enrollment would have to drop by another 5,100 kids for us to drop into that category of basic aid, or combination of both. And I don't think the likelihood of one or the other happening, at least while I'm here, is ever going to happen. So I think the idea or the myth that hey, Cupertino, you should be a basic aid district, or maybe now, why can't Cupertino Union School District be a basic aid, is because of this. There's too many variables that are outside our control that prevent us from becoming a basic aid district. So I thought that was information I thought it was worth sharing, because I hear it quite often, why aren't we? The other thing too is the message, is my soapbox again. Prop 55 passed, we all know that. Thank you for supporting Prop 55. But I think there's some confusion out in the community. It's no different when Prop 30 originally passed. Prop 30 was a temporary tax at the time. Prop 30 was a sales tax, as well as an increase on high income earners. And so Prop 30, which was due to sunset, I think in 2018-19, Prop 55 came along with the support of CTA, a lot of the associations, and so it got passed. But there's some belief, people are thinking that with the passage of Prop 55, it means more money. It means all this newfound money for school districts. It's far from that. Prop 30 was passed to fill a hole, a structural deficit in the budget. Prop 30 was going to go away. The plan at the time, or the thought at the time, was state revenues would have grown beyond the loss of Prop 30, and no one would have thought differently. But that's not the case. So Prop 55 comes in, and again, people are thinking, well, it's new money, but really, Prop 55, all it did was replace Prop 30. So basically, it's it's a continuation of an existing tax. But the one thing too that's really important here, because the sales tax component has gone away, all of Prop 55 is tied to basically the high income earners. So there's some volatility with this because our economy is based on tax revenues. So the upper income folks that are paying more taxes, I mean, who's to say the stock market takes a dive and they're not being subject to as much capital gains tax. So there's some concerns about the volatility of Prop 55, whether or not it really could mean more money. Yeah, if all of a sudden there are 50 times more billionaires in California, and that capital gains tax reached a point, but I don't think, again, the likelihood is not going. It's going to drop. So really, the question here is there a possibility with this tax extension, whether or not it's going to be able to continue at the same level as Prop 30? Yeah.
Just to correct, it's not an extension, it's kind of amended, right? It's going to be there forever, or is 55 again a 7-year?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Let me find out specifically on Prop 55. Okay, so I'm going to wrap here because this is really the beginning dialogue. I've had this kind of slide and shared with you. These are some of the things that are challenges. These are things that we know or things that we don't know. So really, I put this up here so we can have a dialogue and get some feedback from the board. But I shared with you, we're dealing with a structural deficit. From an economic standpoint, we've been hearing now that can the California economy continue at its pace? We've been hearing, and they've used the terminology, slowdown, recession. Both give you different meanings, different connotations. We are hearing more of a slowdown, not necessarily recession. So that's something to think about. We talked about those one-time funding, right? We've been dealing with one-time funding the last several years, and I think it's been very deliberate. Our governor has not been willing to commit a lot of the state revenue on an ongoing basis, so he's been giving us that money on a one-time basis. So I think the joke around town is that we keep receiving all this one-time money each year. It feels like it's ongoing, right? But we can't assume that. The decline of enrollment is an issue. We'll talk about the demographer's report in January. We're a low wealth district, as I shared with you, the PERS and STIRS impact. The big issue right now is negotiation, because right now we're going to be sitting down and I'll be sharing with them. I always shared with the associations what our situation is. So everyone has been made aware of where we are with our current financial situation, and we're just going to continue to get that message out to everybody. Who knows about Obamacare, transportation facilities? Those are some other challenges we deal with. So really, next steps. We've been talking about the Budget Advisory Committee. They have work to do. Let's continue to work with what we have, leverage our resources as much as possible. I mentioned about our attendance rate, maximize attendance, but I don't know if we can do much better than 98%, a little bit more than 98%, but it's wishful thinking. Minimize those encroachments. Keep an eye on the economic news, and then January, about a month from now, we'll get some information on what the governor's proposing. I'll come back to you in January once we have it. Actually, I'll be coming back to you on 2 occasions, just on what we hear back from Sacramento. January is the governor's January budget. I'll come back to you in May after the May revise. But between then, whatever information starts leaking out, we'll know, and we'll share that with the board. So anyway, that's it.
Questions from the board?
Yes, I do.
Kristen?
So I do have a question regarding the property tax and the 107 million.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the 60% of our property tax, which is already allocated between us versus Fremont Union High?
Well, this is our portion. This is
That's
what
our
I'm saying.
portion,
This is
right?
all our portion.
Okay, and I have another comment is, I reviewed those, 2 sets of report, I think those are good to me, looks good. But the presentation do have some typo, I believe.
Oh, where? I apologize.
So, on the page 19,
Which one?
on the
Oh,
slide.
slide 19, I'm sorry.
Right.
Okay.
So the report was fine, but, page 19, here is a 195, 342, 803. I think that's a number,
Mm-hmm.
but if you go back to the, page 18, you will see is a one.
Oh, you're right, I apologize.
And page 11,
Page 11. Page 11, actually, that's revenue.
no, page 11,
I'm sorry.
not 12.
Page
Yes,
11, okay.
the general,
Is the one.
the number is kind of off,
Yeah,
like
so,
$2,000 off. So I think those are typo.
okay,
Just-
I'll verify the number for you, I apologize.
Okay,
The,
yeah, I just wanna
total,
confirm if that's a typo.
the total, out of the document here.
Right.
This is the key.
Right,
So the document shows that our total is $195,342,803.53.
yeah, so that, I believe that's the right number. And
That's the right number.
those two probably is typo.
Typo, I
Yeah.
apologize.
Because those should be consistent.
Yes.
On that last one, I think there's a roundup, it looks like that's what maybe Joy is.
No, it's 1 million off.
No, I don't mean that one, I mean the.
That's $2,000 off.
Okay,
No,
I
that one-
apologize, I made a typo. But again, what you're seeing here in the document, this is the official record
Right.
is reflective, but I will correct the presentation.
Yes. Other questions? Phyllis?
I don't have a question, I just have a comment about the reserve. I'm very, very concerned about that reserve. So I think when we talk about cuts and when you give direction to the Budget Advisory Committee, I would like to make sure that we keep them away from the classroom, we avoid layoffs, and we maintain our board reserve. And I know that's a tall order, but I think we have to go through the budget line by line and make sure that we have done our due diligence so that we can preserve those things within the budget.
Other questions? Leah?
Yes. So, I understand that the deadline for the first interim report is December 13th. That
This month, yeah.
today you need to submit it.
Well, this week, yes, before we go.
So, but then this is put on the board agenda the last week, so we are forced to adopt. Otherwise, what's going to happen?
Well,
I'm
Well, I was
just
just
trying to
gonna
understand
yeah.
the process. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that.
So I think they had said earlier that usually we don't put something on the agenda for the same day we vote. So this was actually, part of this presentation was in the last meeting. You can find it, it's on the public agenda, and he talked about some of
So
the
it's-
same things.
Yeah, I kind
So
of
this is the
feel
second
I've
time we're
heard
seeing-
it, so it's
Yeah.
the same thing.
Yeah, it's at the
Same
last
thing.
meeting.
I think
Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I kind of feel it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
But can I also too, hate to say it, all other districts, what happens is, it's usually at their December meeting, they bring the first interim report, because first interim reflects all the expenditures as of October 31st. What happens is staff pretty much the whole month of November to make the budget adjustment. So it's very unlikely that a district's going to have a full first interim report done by the time we meet in November. This is not enough turnaround time. So that is also the reason why our December board, usually to school districts, December board meetings are always going to be in advance of when we have to submit to the county. That's a requirement that every district has to follow. So it's unfortunate that we can't have first interim done a whole month or 2 months beforehand, but there's not enough time to actually put together the report. So.
And then the second interim report is due on the March 13th?
Well, it will correspond with our first meeting in March, but again, it's the same thing. It's reflective of all the expenditures through the end of January. And so basically staff just has the whole month of February to put the report together to be able to present it to the board at our first meeting in March.
But in the calendar we have, the second interim report would be presented to the board on the March 14th. So as I understand, then probably it should be presented to the meeting before, and then we'll adopt on the March 14th.
So usually what happens is they do bring us they bring us like what they did with this one, like in November. That's why there was slight change in numbers, because they did to bring us most of the report, which is very close to what it's going to be, and then we have to adopt it the following meeting.
Yes, so that's why I'm saying this calendar, it says that second interim report is on March 14th.
That's
actually the date we adopted.
That's the
right?
adoption, that's not the presentation.
So
We can
will
always,
have a presentation one
in-
meeting earlier.
in February.
Trying to understand that.
Can I make a correction? I apologize out of respect. In the past, we would normally bring to the board the meeting that we do take action. That's usually the first time we go over the first interim report. The reason why I brought this information to you last meeting was because of the sense of urgency about saying we need to start engaging the stakeholders around the cut. So I mentioned to our board at the time that we needed to be making some cuts. So that's why I was very deliberate to bring that information to the board as early, and also too because Julia was on medical leave, and you know she got this done like about a week ago. But normally in the past, what we would do is we would bring to the board the first interim report at that meeting. And I apologize again. That the amount of turnaround time that we have, and and for the period of time that we have to account for the first interim report, there's no possible way that I can bring to you the first interim report any sooner, because again, like with the month of November, we only have one meeting, and so with that early meeting, that will have only given staff about 2 weeks to work on the first interim. They were literally working on this all the way through the Thanksgiving break. So that's the same, and that's the same thing with February, because of February, we only have I think one meeting in February, and so it does not give us enough time the way the board meetings are scheduled. We just have to make sure that we can deliver to the county by that
Wendy.
time in March.
Yeah, so if you look at our budget, it's getting late now, agenda planning calendars, going back several years, you see the same cycle. It is exact same cycle, and it's the same cycle that all school districts are going through, and it is not driven by us making a decision saying, okay, we're gonna change those dates. It's driven by the information that is required to go to the county, and also driven by information we actually receive from the state. So it is an awkward process, we can all admit that. If the state says, for example, on May 15th, they're gonna give you the May revised, and you have to completely adjust that budget, but they also tell you that you get that on May. They don't even approve their own budget until June, and they want ours by June 30th. And so, we're held hostage to that process, really. I think every CBO and every fiscal person, every superintendent would say, sure, we would love it to not be that way, but that's the cycle that we have to follow. And it's very difficult because even engaging around planning and, you know, how you're gonna resource things, and you don't even know what that resource is, you know, going into June sometimes.
But having said that, at the same time, if the board feels like we need to hear more about the budget because of the way it is this year, it's a challenging year because we have to look at recommendations, it would come to us before. It doesn't have to come in this format, but it could come to us in various formats so that we are kept in loop of what's happening and what are the recommendations that are gonna come.
So what's your target right now, that the amount we should cut for this year? Do you have a number? And what's the schedule that you are considering these cuts? I mean, we have these meeting schedules, right? Do you have the timeline in mind? Okay, here's how we will.
Well, excuse me, from a timeline standpoint, as the budget calendar kind of shows you, we have to make, as a district, some decisions on what that final budget looks like. So we're going to be bringing to you that information as soon as we can, but we have to have a decision on what the budget is going to look like by April, because once April hits, we're working on putting the budget together, and then the last bit of update information we get in May is the May revise. So what typically will happen is, you know, we would direct staff to start putting the budget together, with the exception of finalizing the revenue, because usually with the May revision, they start tinkering around with the revenue assumptions. So that's usually the last thing that we adjust. But so to build the budget, we have to be in a certain place as far as what amount of reductions, I would say, by the beginning of April. And that is on purpose, again, to allow us and the Budget Advisory Committee literally time to start working on it. I mean, we've been having this conversation with the Budget Advisory now for about 2 meetings now. And so December, we're meeting tomorrow. So we're gonna go through the presentation, I'll make the correction with that, but we're gonna go over this with them tomorrow. So that from a timeline standpoint, we have to identify what those cuts are. And if I heard you correct, what is my recommendation to the board? I think I mentioned it earlier, at a minimum, when I'm assuming right now that we're not gonna maybe spend every dollar in the budget, we need to cut a minimum of $3 million just to stay ahead of, if the board wants us to make sure that we don't dip into that board reserve, because a $3 million ongoing reduction in 2017 becomes $6 million in the second year. So 3, 6 is that number to maintain that $11 million. But that fourth year still is the problem. And so back to the assumptions, some things can still change as far as what those revenue assumptions are for those outer years. We're basing it on right now what school service is projecting for those years, because the COLA is very minimal. So I think the COLA projected for the next couple of years, it's actually in here. So if you want to see what our assumptions are, so if you were to go to either report, it's the last section in either report, but there is a section that talks about the revenue assumptions. So on this document, the financial report, it's actually page 71. If you look at the chart there, it talks about what the COLA assumptions are. So this year was a 0 COLA. Next year, 17-18, based on what we know, the projected COLA is 1.11. The following year, based on the forecast, the COLA is projected to be 2.42, 2.57. The next year, 1.55. Those are going to change, but those are the things that we're going to need to kind of keep an eye on too.
But Chris, in my limited experience, those change always in a downward direction. The COLA, I don't ever remember the COLA going up. It always seems to either go down or go to 0, as it did this year. So
we never want to go negative, but there was one year, remember? There was one year we had the negative COLA. It was a negative 1.2% COLA in the middle of the year.
So I think we have to be really careful to rely on that COLA assumption, because it's very suspect.
I mean, we still have to maintain a level of conservativeness, with things, and so, you know, Julia and I we do a very good job of trying to keep our assumptions conservative, but it's getting a little bit more difficult now when we having to deal with this structural concern, because, I mean, and I think I thought I shared this with you in the last couple of years since LCFF has created, there has always been a difference in what the Department of Finance is making an assumption on the revenue projection and the LCFF gap closure, and school services. So there's always been a difference between what the Department of Finance and school services. They're always very good about landing on the same number in the current budget year, but their projections will differ. But that all goes away as soon as the LCFF gap completely closes. Because once that happens, once that gap closes, all we are is subject to COLA. It's kind of back to the old model. Before LCFF, you get whatever the state COLA is, nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah, and the other thing is, the cuts you're referring to is we actually made some cuts last year, if you remember. So we cut the 2 district office positions, the 2 directors, and a couple APs. So we actually already started that process, just looking at internally what we felt, what we kind of built in when the money was coming, the work that was done, and what we could take away. So that process actually already started, and that these figures do account for that already.
So it's nice to know that we have 85% budget is spent on people, and 84% in instruction and related expense. But I'm wondering, do we have more detailed data on, for example, on people? How much is on classroom teachers and other support teachers and substitute teachers? And how about for instruction? How about professional development and expenses to support those professional development and technology and curriculum expense? Do we have that breakdown?
So good question to ask. I can answer the first question. The last 4 or 5 questions are a little bit more detailed than this document provides, because again, the board right now is taking action on the total budget, but some of the questions in the detail, we'll have to come back and provide that information to the board. But your first question, I believe, was how much, any idea how much we're spending on classroom teachers, how much are we spending on certain types of maybe credentialed folks. So on page 6 of the SACS report, basically gives you a total for the general fund broken down by those major object code categories. I mentioned earlier that the 1000 series are all certificated teachers. But when you look at this document, it breaks it down further. So there are 1,100 certificated teacher salaries, 1,200 certificated pupil support salaries, 1,300 object code certificated supervisors and administrative salaries, and 1,900 other certificated salaries. And it's the same thing for the classified employees too. So when you look at it, for the most part, all classroom teachers are going to fall within that first category, the object code 1100. So as you can see there, you know, the total projected year total is about $74.8 million. So that's pretty much classroom teachers, special ed, regular ed.
Do we know the head counts for this? This is total salary.
Yeah, there's another table in the report that shows FTEs. It's in the other report, the financial report. So it's on page.
Yeah, I remember that.
It's on page 10. Page 10 in this document here, the financial report, gives you an FTE count.
Yeah, this is, I remember it's FTE count by fund.
Mm-hmm.
So it has a count under each fund, but then it's hard to find out what's the total count across all the fund.
Oh, I mean a subtotal.
Yeah, a total for each category across the fund.
Okay. I mean, I think I provided something for Wendy. I have a summary table I can share with the board. All I would do is just summarize these 4 pages.
That's okay. I mean, in the future, this kind of information will be helpful. And then,
So I have to clarify that. So in the report he's giving, probably not necessarily the place we're gonna put it, but if you're saying what you want is, in addition to that, you wanna know what our total FTE is when we start the year or we end the year or something, we can provide that to you. Just when you say it's helpful, it might be, but it might be something that we provide you because you're asking us what that total amount is.
Oh, because the report already have that category under each fund, right? So
Right.
if we have a subtotal in this report, that would be, make that more complete, right?
I'm kind of confused, when you showed us on page 10 of the regular, the first interim, it says Fund 1110, and when you look on page 6 of the SACS report, it also says 1100, right? So isn't that the same code, or is that a different code?
1110 references the object code, but I think what Liang is referring to, when you look at right above there, it says Fund 01 General Fund.
Mm-hmm.
So the total I showed on page 6 of this document is the sum total
Of all the,
of page 10, and page 11, and page 12, and page 13. So those pages 10, 11, 12, and 13 are broken out
Part of
individually by
11,
subfund,
1100.
but they all total the amount of FTEs in the total budget.
It's just one more pie chart, or,
No, it's just a summary. We can summarize. We can put total.
So I'm referring to this FTE summary section. She already has the headcount for FTE for Fund 01,
Right.
Fund 2, so all the data is there. I'm just asking if we can have, but then they are separate by fund. So if we can have like one summary,
one page.
all the fund, what's the different category, that would be nice. It just makes it more.
It's probably not required by the state.
This is not the state requirement.
No, it's something that we
This is
provide.
our report.
We can add a summary page. We'll put it in.
Just one comment, this is regarding the consent calendar, I was not able to comment. So I abstained because I don't feel comfortable voting yes, because this list of $6 million spending is checks by date. So it would be nice if we can separate that into categories so that we know where we are spending on this consent calendar checks. I don't know if it's.
I apologize, I
I
wasn't
don't know.
following.
Wait,
It's about the warrant list.
the warrant list?
The one, yeah.
The warrant list.
Oh, this is not part of this.
Yeah, it's not part of
Can
this.
we please
Okay,
stay on
yeah.
track, because it
Okay.
kind of, we wanna,
It's late.
yeah, we wanna kind of stay on track and get through the agenda, and then we can talk about that in the future. So any other questions, for this? If not, then, thank you, Chris, for all your information. I need a motion for item 10.1.
I move 10.1.
I second.
It's a roll call vote. Leanne?
Yes.
Phyllis?
Yes.
Kristen?
Yes.
Soma?
Yes.
Anjali, yes. Now we are moving on to 10.2, which is the approval of the 2017-18 school year calendar and staff learning days. It's open